Thank you. All right, great. So you can tell I'm not I'm just going to put my clock on because I'm going to keep an eye on the time. I'm not a preacher because when Rosemary asked me for an outline of my talk, I gave her like 40 slides. So that's why you've ended up with an extra booklet this morning, but that's what I'm going to kind of work through this morning and just hopefully share some thinking with you from the lens that I take into relationships as a family therapist, as a counsellor, and increasingly kind of in teaching and stuff about what does it mean to be in relationship and what do we learn about ourselves in relationship. And this question today that we're thinking about, what help is helpful, and really thinking about the reciprocity. So when I say reciprocity, what I mean is a dance, that how two things kind of play out together between responsibility and care. And that's what we're going to have a think about today. But firstly, I want to introduce you to Melrick. So Melrick, on the next slide, we'll get a picture of Melrick, I think. Yeah, he's in there somewhere. Melrick was the king's magician. So every day, he carried out the king's orders. If the king wanted to swim, Melrick made the sun come out. If the king was too hot, Melrick made the sun go in. When he wasn't working for the king, Melrick helped everybody else, all by magic. Melrick was always busy. No one else was busy at all. One morning, Melrick woke up late and muttered the spell that should have got him ready immediately, but nothing happened. He shouted the spell, nothing happened. He struggled to get ready. He didn't even know how to make his bed because he'd never done it by hand before. He's always used magic, but he went to see the king. The king was angry. He wanted a room painted, and there was a crowd waiting for Melrick outside to help them. Melrick tried and tried, but nothing happened, and gradually everyone realised what the trouble was. Melrick's magic was gone. As the people began to realise that Melrick couldn't help them, they tried to do things for themselves, things they hadn't done for ages. But there was trouble everywhere. Even simple things went wrong, and this is the picture you get here. Everyone trying to kind of rediscover their skills, and kind of it's a bit of a catastrophe. Poor Melrick left feeling very sad that he was of no use. And the story goes on, and this is a real book. This is called Melrick the Magician Who Lost His Magic. Story goes on that Melrick goes to ask his witch sister and then his wizard cousin for advice, and then he eventually goes to find the wise Kra for help. He has to walk, of course, because he can't transport himself any other way anymore. And all along the way, he passes people trying to do things they haven't attempted for years, and Melrick kind of hurries on, realising it's going pretty badly, hoping to get things sorted out so he can help everyone again. When he reaches the bottom of Kra's mountain, he's really exhausted. He knew that Kra would see him, but he wouldn't lift a finger to help him. When he finally reaches the top of the mountain, he tells his story to Kra. "You are stupid," says Kra. "You just wasted your magic instead of helping people." "What?" Melrick shouted. "I've always helped people. I've done everything for them." "That's just the trouble," says Kra. "You've taught them to rely on you, and when you fail them, they can't do a thing for themselves. That's not helping them." Kra gives Melrick his magic back with a warning not to waste it again. Now, when Melrick gets back, he finds his castle under siege. An enemy army has heard about the magician's lost magic and wasted no time in exploiting the vulnerabilities of his city that couldn't do anything for themselves. And Melrick decides this is actually what his magic is for. It goes a bit weird. He turns them all into cats, saves the day, whatever. Everything was back to normal. With Melrick back, people defaulted immediately into asking him to do things for them again. However, Melrick has changed his position, telling the people they must manage without him, and he would only use his magic for special occasions. And lo and behold, people start to learn to do things for themselves. And it ends with this picture of Melrick making his bed for himself. There are people, Jane Austen says in one of my favourite books, Emma, who, the more you do for them, the less they will do for themselves. Now, it might seem like a really obvious statement, but yet it seems to be one of the predictable patterns in relationships that we constantly fall into. And what I'm going to talk about today is how I think systems thinking describes this dynamic as a reciprocal dynamic of what we call over-functioning and under-functioning. And I'm going to talk about how I think that's a process that's driven by anxiety in relationships. So, Firstly, predictable patterns in relationships, including helping relationships. So you're probably familiar with the description of our fight, flight and freeze response, which is the body's automatic response to when we come across something that our brain perceives as a threat. So it could be a real or an imagined threat, and it's the case for all of us that the fight, flight and freeze response is an automatic reflex. It kicks in to kind of equip us and help us to manage that threat. It's our body giving us the resources that we need to protect ourselves and be able to tackle the stress or the thing well. Now, it's the predictability of that response and having self-awareness that actually makes managing anxiety and stress more manageable. And in anxiety treatment, it's largely about being aware of that. What does it feel like? What are the symptoms like? When does it happen? The knowledge of it actually helps in the management of it. Murray Bowen, whose work I'm drawing on today to talk about systems thinking, thought that people did similarly predictable things in relationships to manage them when they were stressful. So here you get some really familiar things. They fight, they flight, they distance or freeze, and he adds a few. They fret to others, they triangle in other people, and they move into fix, which we're talking about today, over and under functioning. When relationships are tense and when they're stressful, when they're a bit uncomfortable or not going well, or when we feel anxious or aroused, these are the automatic things that we do in order to kind of get the relationship more comfortable again, or to try and make things just a little bit more easier. These 4 things are all trying to do the same thing, trying to do something with the unease or the stress or the tension to get more comfortable. Now, again, the predictability of these things is really important because it's about understanding and observing these responses in relationships, growing in our own self-awareness of our relationship habits, I would call them, and which one or some of these we might do more of to manage our stress that helps us to actually identify them, know what they look like, know what they feel like, and ultimately to be able to interrupt unhealthy patterns that helps us to be intentional about doing things differently. Now, while Bowen observed these patterns in relationships, in families, it's very easy to observe how they can translate into all sorts of relationships we have. And I think the helping relationship, for example, you might be able to recognise some of the way these patterns play out. So if we think about fight in a helping relationship, maybe it's about getting annoyed or irritated with the person. Maybe flight or freeze, maybe it's about avoiding people. Fretting to others, talking about them to other people rather than kind of talking to them. And fixing, the kind of over helping to relieve distress. Now, we could spend time on all of these, but it's the last one today that we're going to kind of pay a bit more attention to. So, how do we think about this desire to kind of fix in relationships and the idea of over-functioning and under-functioning? So, over-functioning in relationships is really taking on for someone else or doing for someone else what they could actually do for themselves. And under-functioning is the flip side of this, looking to others to do things for them, so that they don't have to do them themselves. So Bowen described this dynamic, how this dynamic can really easily occur in the context of counselling. So he was a psychiatrist, family therapist. That's the context of his work. And he says this: when the therapist allows him or herself to become a healer or repairman, the family goes into dysfunction to wait for the therapist to accomplish her work. Now, Melrick's story is a great example of this reciprocity. The more Melrick did for the people, the less the people did for themselves. And what happened over time was that people became dependent on Melrick to do things and were then unable to do things for themselves. So if we think about Melrick, when the magician allows him or herself to become a healer or repairman, the family goes into dysfunction to wait for the magician to accomplish their work. That's a great description of that story in some ways, isn't it? Melrick's helping efforts actually eroded the capacity of the people to do things for themselves by not having the space to do it or the opportunity to develop their own skills, and creating a perpetual relationship which offered them the opportunity to outsource that. The people were actually left in a worse position because of Melrick's helping. That's pretty interesting to think about, isn't it? In his approach to therapy, Bowen continually emphasised on the part of the therapist to not do the family's work for them, but to respect them as experts in their own lives and as people able to problem solve if they had the space and the opportunity to do that. What about then if we thought about this for ourselves as friends or family, pastoral carers and helpers? If we think about this helper slide, when the helper allows him or herself to become a healer or repairman, the other person goes into dysfunction to wait for the helper to accomplish their work. Now, one thing I want to say here is that overfunctioning is not a personality trait, okay? And it's not a kind of pathological category that we're talking about. It's one end of a dance of this reciprocal relationship process. People often act in ways to invite us to be responsible for them and to be over-responsible for them. I don't know about your house, but they'll leave dishes in the sink because they know that they'll magically get washed up. They won't worry about forgetting things because they know that they'll be reminded. They'll look to you to tell them what to do. They'll wait for you to make the first contact, or they might not tell you they're struggling unless you ask them. It's really important to remember that the dynamic of over and under functioning is this dance, that it's reciprocal, it goes hand in hand, meaning that both people play a role. We all have family members, friends and colleagues who are happy to let us take over if it calms everyone down. But what is the cost when this pattern plays out repeatedly in a marriage or a friendship or in caring for someone? That even well-intentioned efforts to help might not be as helpful as we think they are. Overfunctioning or underfunctioning are part of this automatic reflex kind of knee-jerk reaction that we have as a way of relieving the anxiety or uncomfortableness in the relationship. So we can jump in to fix or get invited to fix really easily, especially when there's really strong emotions involved. So the thing that gets confused in this process is that it gets very blurry about what the problem actually is and who is responsible for what in that process. Now, this is a great picture by Dr. Seuss that captures this, and with a beautiful poem that goes with it, who talks about a family whose horns are so entwined together that, as he says, none of them can tell if his horns are hers or the other way around. What belongs to who is the question here. In a helping relationship, when someone comes in with a fixing approach, it gets confused for both people. Who is doing what? About what? And who actually feels better about the act of helping? Is it the helper or is it about the person being helped? And actually what can happen is that the overfunctioner, who's probably pretty good at problem solving, can take up the very space that the other person needs to work on their own problems and build their capacity to do that for themselves in the long term. This, in turn, can create a dependency on other people, including the helper, to keep doing things for them. And so I've got up there just this description of this. When a helper takes over, it can diminish the other person's space to think for themselves, to problem solve, and to learn how to emotionally regulate, things that will actually benefit them in the long term, and that they can become reliant on the other person for their functioning. When someone becomes a rescuer, giving someone advice, accepting their invitation to solve their problem, this reinforces the idea that they're helpless, that they cannot solve the problem, that they might need help, that they are the problem. And since they have someone over-functioning for them, their own functioning can go down in response to that. Now, one of the things that can actually happen in relationships, especially if it's between two well-meaning people, so we're definitely talking on a spectrum of this happens for all of us, two well-meaning people who like and respect each other, is that people automatically act in ways to keep the relationship feeling okay. So this is certainly the case in counselling, where people can become anxious about saying or doing the right thing because they kind of want to guess what the therapist wants them to say and it go well, But I think it's definitely a dynamic that can play out in churches and pastoral contexts as well, where people usually really like the pastors or the helpers or the leaders, and they can get anxious about saying and doing the right thing, especially when it comes to spiritual growth. And what can happen in these well-meaning relationships is that if the helper takes over the space by telling the person what to think or what to do, then there isn't actually the space for the person to be themselves and express themselves differently or their own thinking about that. Now, this can be really overt, but it can also be really subtle as well. But people do work out what the other person would like or what would be approved of. What do they think would be okay? And so they start to adopt those ideas for the sake of being well thought of and approved and accepted in the group. And that's an example of, in systems thinking, what we talk about in terms of people kind of giving up self in the relationship. It's just acting the way they think will be approved or accepted rather than being able to be themselves in that. Now, Michael Kerr says this about the over and under-functioning dynamic. The over-functioning person is typically one who feels responsible for the emotional well-being of others and who works to compensate for perceived, real or imagined deficits in their functioning. The under-functioning person, on the other hand, feels dependent on the over-functioning one to do things that they feel reluctant or unable to do themselves. So this can be driven by a kind of anxiety that is either real or imagined, and imagining that the other person can't do it, or the other person losing confidence enough in themselves that they can do it, and so asking someone in to do that for themselves. So one of the questions is, what drives us, or anyone or the other, in these patterns to manage stress in the relationships, to fight or distance or take sides with others, or to do what we're talking about in terms of over or under functioning? If you are prone to problem solving for others in your family in anxious times growing up, it can be difficult to prevent yourself from falling into the same pattern in other relationships. Similarly, if you are used to others problem solving for you in your family, it can be difficult to take responsibility for your own self-direction at work. Let me give you an example of this. Ben grew up as the eldest of 3 children. He was an active, outgoing boy and was popular amongst his peers at school. He had a charm that really got people on his side, which was helpful because he was often in and out of trouble. His middle sister, Lena, was the complete opposite. She was studious, worked hard, joined every club she could at school, and while she wasn't very popular, she had enough like-minded friends to get through each day. There was a big age gap between Lena and the youngest, Maya. She was doted on by the family, even though she could sometimes be pretty annoying. The parents, Hugh and Mary, had been married for a long time. Life was pretty busy, holding jobs, seeing the extended family, managing the household. In reality, Mary did most of the things at home. She carried what she had heard her friend describe as the mental load. Ben really wanted to keep life simple. He clocked off work at 5 o'clock, made the most of his work breaks, and spent as much time as he could at the pub with his mates and at home with his family. Things usually carried on pretty well for this family, but one of the things that was stressful for this family was the recurring naughty behaviours of Ben. He wasn't a malicious kid, but he was quite oppositional and often in trouble. Lena knew how much her parents worried about Ben, and she would often try and see him at school to see how his day was going. When she knew he'd been in trouble, she would try and get home first and see her mum and tell her so that she was prepared. Lena would then try and make sure she and Maya stayed out of the way in the evening, and she would often try and do a couple of extra jobs just to make things easier for her mum. Sometimes this cycle drove Lena mad. She thought her parents were too soft, but mostly she just didn't like to see them stressed. She mostly avoided any of the conflict, and instead, because she knew that her own efforts to do well were a relief to her parents, she worked harder and harder, and their approval reassured her efforts. Over time, Lena was so used to these same patterns playing out that her mum would ask her how Ben's day was at school. Sometimes her mum told her how worried she was about Ben. But often, Lena knew that just helping out and being with her mum pleased her and calmed her down, and she would regularly do this. Welcome to the family of the Simpsons. It's a good description. You know, I could have gone with so many other descriptions here. I could have gone with Emma in Jane Austen. People who are primed to be a helper in relationships. I could have gone with Mirabelle, from Encanto. I could have gone from Michael Bluth from Arrested Development. Doesn't have to be a lady. He's definitely an over-functioning sort. Or I could have talked about me. There's no accident in my family that I was primed to be a helper, and one sister became an entrepreneur and another one became a lawyer. Now, based loosely on this family, if we were to hypothesize about the sorts of relational sensitivities that Lena, or Lisa, would take into her future relationships, for example, we get a sense of how people are primed to do one or more of these things. So Lisa's growing up and the way the whole family system functioned wires her to be someone who's highly attuned to worry, to people-pleasing and over-accommodating for others. And this working most of the time, right? It makes sense that she would adopt these same relationship habits and replicate them elsewhere. Now, we're not going to spend a long time on this, and there's a lot more theory behind this in terms of the thinking about this, but it does raise the question about what your own experiences, particularly in your own family of origin, have primed you for. So when you look at this list, what are your automatic reactions in relationships? Do you over-accommodate for others? Or do you control or direct others? Or over-nurture or care for them and do things for them? Or do you avoid and distance? Or take sides with people and feel better when people agree with you or share your opinion with you? Now, none of these things are bad. They are really natural ways that we adapt and use ourselves in relationships and make life work. But what we are tuned to or sensitive to in our families can also play out automatically in other relationships because they're under our skin. And ministry relationships are one area where this happens really easily. So being aware of how we're wired and our own automatic reactions to stress in relationships can help us grow in what we talk about as emotional maturity and ultimately be a better help to others as we take responsibility for ourselves in our relationships. Now, when we're thinking about this sort of helping relationship in churches, it gets my own thinking going about the following type of question. What does it look like to serve in a God-honouring, sacrificial way while still allowing other people to be responsible for themselves, to do their own thinking and not to be hindered in their growth by our helping efforts? Now, these are really important questions about being under the lordship of Christ and serving others, as well as seeing people as people that God has made, giving people the space and opportunity to flourish and God to do his work in them, not my work in them. How do we help them and not let our helping efforts accidentally get in the way of this? I think a really nice illustration of this balance is in Galatians 6, and Rosemary just did a fantastic job this morning unpacking this, and I really appreciate the kind of biblical foundation that she's given for me to back this up with. We are to care for others and carry their burdens, and we are also to take responsibility for ourselves. And I think the more awareness we have of our own reactivity and how we affect others in relationships can be a piece of this. Now, it's really easy to see this and for it to make sense, but it's much harder to do in reality. So what I wanted to do is actually just to take a step back and draw on some parenting research to try and understand this over and under functioning pattern a little bit better and how easy it is to get caught in those patterns and the challenge it is to be intentional and to try and do things differently. Now, not everyone here will be a parent, but I hope that in being able to just kind of include some research more broadly, that you're able to kind of see another application of how this pattern plays out in other relationships. But everyone's been in their own family as well, so maybe it will be familiar. So, some lessons from parenting research. Peter Stearns, a professor of social history at George Mason University in Washington, D.C., has studied trends in US parenting over the last century. He notes that as parenting manuals emerged in the 20th century, they became a stimulus and outlet for parents' worries and added fuel to what he describes as a century of anxiety about the child and about parents' own adequacy. So what's really interesting in this is that that little number on the left there says the 1940s. He's tracked that was really when the first parenting manuals, a how-to guide, was released. And from there, there's been an upward trend of both parenting manuals, the orange line, but alongside that, parental anxiety going up as well. As parents outsource their development of child-rearing wisdom, they can easily become more uncertain in themselves. It's such an interesting thing to think about, isn't it? As parents relied more and more on external opinions and expert advice, they lost confidence in what they were actually doing as parents, or on drawing on their own thinking and experience and resources, including within their own families as well. It raises the question around what do you think the job of a parent is, and who gives you that opinion? The emphasis on safe children, happy children, clever children, children who are emotionally intelligent, generous, resilient, successful, popular, have led to parents making projects out of their children, but simultaneously less confident than ever in how to do that. This list here, taken from Jenny Brown's really excellent research and work on parenting, highlights just how much anxiety as parents can dominate what parents do or don't do. This feeds into a really anxious process in the parent-child relationships, with parents scanning their children for things that might be wrong, jumping into direct and trying to shape their children rather than giving them space to grow and develop in their own thinking and character. It's really easy, I think, to see how this can get quite intense. Little things turn into big things, and things we think might be a problem are evidenced by small things that in turn make the parents more anxious that it's a problem, so they treat it as a problem. You start collecting evidence to say that it's true. The more anxious a parent is, the more they focus on the child and the impact of this focus. And the more intense this is, the more sensitive we become to how things are going. Both the parent and the child get hyper-attuned to things like expectations, what's approved of or not, trying to not let people get distressed and needing attention or being upset by a lack of attention. These things are really automatic, but they can feed into relationships, and the more intense the relationship, the more sensitivity there is. And the more sensitivity there is, the higher the intensity. You can see how this goes round and round. So if we think about this dance between parents and children, this is just an example about what this looks like in the parent-child relationship. It's an example of what it can look like and how it can turn into a parent taking over for the child as part of this and not giving them space to be able to do the growing and learning that they need to. So in this dance, you see things between the parent and child about neither being able to tolerate distress, finding that difficult, and really being attuned to each other and scanning one another for evidence, and kind of getting cues from the other about how they should act or shouldn't act and what's okay and what's not okay. All quite kind of covertly, sometimes overtly as well. So when this is going round and round in relationships, what actually helps and what can a parent do? Well, the research on parenting shows us that helping can inadvertently crowd another person's space or opportunity to grow and develop their own resources for coping. So, for example, a parent trying to fix things for their child means the child doesn't get the opportunity to work on this for themselves. What Bowen found in his research in families over time was that the most favourable results was with parents who could make a project out of themselves, not their child. And then he talked about that as being a real turning point for him in the development of his theory and practice in kind of systems theory. There's increasing evidence to suggest that the more parents are able to shift the focus to working on themselves as parents, on working on managing their own emotions, managing their own responses, being clear in their own parenting, the better the outcomes for parents and children as well. And I think the research on resilience is a really good example on this. So every parent wants their child to be resilient. I mean, who doesn't? Look at this list. You want them to have distress tolerance, you want them to be able to calm themselves, you want them to be able to problem solve, and you want them to be aware of self and others. That's a pretty nice list, isn't it? But an intense focus by a parent on a child trying to change them doesn't actually help that happen. What does happen, and what is emerging more and more, is that parents working on their own resilience is the thing that helps promote resilience in children. So here you get parents who are working on their own distress tolerance, tolerating your own and others' uncomfortable emotions and being able to sit in that for longer and not having to move it on really quickly, accepting really difficult emotions, calming self down rather than calming the other person down, the capacity to reduce your own stress, arousal. What does that look like to kind of calm yourself down? A problem-solving effort that is actually about your own problems, not someone else's, and being aware of self and others. So the ability to focus on and speak for yourself rather than reacting to others. So the more parents are able to work on this for themselves, you start to see how it gives space for other people around them to do the same. And that's what the emerging research is showing. So we're going to step back a little bit again and come back to the helping relationship, so broadening the lens on helping. Where we start to get to in applying some of those principles and kind of thinking about some of those things is that even love for others and well-intentioned help can sometimes be unhelpful if it doesn't allow the other person to have agency. And when I'm talking about agency, I'm talking about the ability for someone to think for themselves, to learn to emotionally regulate themselves, and to learn for themselves. So, I'm going to give you a moment just to turn to the person next to you and have a think about this question, what help is helpful? I'm going to turn to the person next to you and think about, in your own experience, how can you tell the difference between help that helps another person take responsibility and help that takes responsibility from them? So I hope that question makes sense. Help that helps another person take responsibility for their stuff. I guess I liked that description this morning. And the difference between that helps kind of the help version of that, which is taking other people's stuff away from them. So I'm only going to give you a minute. If you need to stand and stretch your legs, please do. And then we'll come back together. Okay, I'm going to bring it back. I said just a minute. What I'm enjoying as I'm looking out here is, I'm going to call everyone back together. That's all right. Ooh. What I'm enjoying is seeing people talk. If you're a hands talker like me, I'm seeing a lot of this. You're sort of holding it together. Keep those conversations going. What I want you to do is to hold on to that thinking as we work through some of the next material and think about what fits for you and your own experience and trying some of this on in your thinking. Okay. So I want to explore the idea of what help is helpful by exploring this help a bit more and drawing on some more research. And this type of help that we're talking about that promotes a person taking responsibility for themselves and developing their own agency. So here I'm drawing on the work of Jenny Brown, who's the author of Growing Yourself Up. So she started the institute that I now run, and I also so she works for me at the institute, and I now work for her in my private practice. What Jenny found in her doctoral research and kind of in her ongoing kind of research is that there is a relationship between parents' hope in their child's mental health treatment and agency, self-efficacy. So what I mean is this: parents who remained more passive in seeking mental health treatment and expecting expert helpers to fix their child were found to have experienced reduced hope months after finishing in the treatment program. Conversely, if parents were actively involved in changing themselves and working on themselves as part of their child's treatment, they experienced increased hope and effectiveness in contributing to their child's recovery. So this is the idea that parents outsourcing their ideas to experts actually decreased their confidence and increased their anxiety about whether they were doing a good enough job as parents. It's a good example of how dependence on the other, whether it's another person or an expert or a service, can undermine someone's agency and their own thinking about what's best. I'm going to go to the next slide. I'm not going to go into this in a whole lot of detail. This is a quote from a woman called Judith Herman, who wrote a book called Trauma and Recovery in the early 90s, a really formative book in the literature on trauma. It's still kind of referred to in lots of things like The Body Keeps the Score. You know, it's really helpful. I was particularly interested in this description by Judith Herman about the role of a therapist helping people who have experienced trauma. That's the work. The context. What she talks about here is, she says, in entering the treatment relationship, the therapist promises to respect the patient's autonomy by remaining disinterested and not neutral. Disinterested means that the therapist abstains from using her power over the patient to gratify her personal needs. Neutral means the therapist does not take sides in the patient's inner conflicts or try and direct the patient's life decisions. Constantly reminding herself that the patient is in charge of her own life, the therapist refrains from advancing a personal agenda. The disinterested and neutral stance is an ideal to be striven for, never perfectly attained. Disinterested is not a word we go for in pastoral care. I don't know if you heard that and went, oh, that's not a good fit, right? It's not uninterested, okay? But what the point Herman is making here is that the helper has to make an effort to keep their own agenda out of the picture. Efforts to change, manipulate, or direct another person can actually hinder their being able to take responsibility for themselves. And people having agency is essential in their growing, even in the most difficult of mental health issues. There is a way, I think this is talking about, of being empathic, which does not mean having to ride the emotional roller coaster with people, but being in good emotional contact with them, getting alongside them, and helping them think and keep working on their own stuff. So what does helping someone develop their thinking and agency look like? How do you do this? I actually think that having some idea about how the brain works can help in navigating some of this, because it helps us to think about how to position ourselves alongside another person as a resource and open up thinking and possibilities and change that come from them. Learning and exploring and putting pieces together themselves and developing their own convictions and making change. Now, I found this article. It's been very hard to find some other things on this, but I found this article a little while ago on the neuroscience of asking insightful questions. And I found it pretty interesting. It goes on to the next slide. It's in your slides. You can read it later as well. I'm just going to pull out a couple of quotes where they say, "There's nothing wrong with being good at problem solving, except when it gets in the way of preventing the people you lead from learning and developing. Because when you solve problems for the people who report to you, those people don't get a chance to do their own thinking or take ownership of the solutions." I think you're hearing a familiar theme. Talks about the neuroplasticity of the brain means that when you ask a question, instead of giving the answer, the entire brain gets active as it reflects, and it releases serotonin, which allows it to relax. And what that encourages is basically a firing of all the neurons in the neural pathways and gathering intelligence from different areas of the brain as a person does that work and gets their own cogs going on that. New neuronal connections begin to be made as the brain moves closer to finding solutions. So let's look at the flip side of this. What is the help that doesn't help? Taking on another person's responsibilities, acting on behalf of another person, quickly giving advice, telling others what to do, diagnosing and prescribing what should happen, taking sides, which is about agreeing that other people are the problem and they need to change, trying to remove another person's distress. And for those who might be on the other end of this, on underfunctioning, avoiding having any contact and talking about difficult things. And so the help that helps is being in good contact with someone, but not over-involved or under-involved, but letting that person have their own space for thinking, problem-solving, and working things out. These are some of the ways this might play out. Coming alongside the other person, so being present, allowing them to be upset or distressed, giving them room to find their best thinking, listening well, asking about how the person is dealing with these things, seeing the bigger picture of relationships, so not taking sides, but helping the person observe themselves in their relationships, asking about the whole person, not just their problems, so avoiding that intense focus every time you talk to them, not trying to change them, but sharing your own thinking when appropriate. So it's not about being a no-self, it's actually about hearing them and going, oh, this is what it's got me thinking about, or this is what got me really interested, or these are the questions that are coming up for me, in that kind of reciprocity. So what we're moving into is this question around what does it mean to be a mature helper? I think one of the distinctions to make between two types of helping is this. What is the difference between being responsible for another person and what is the difference between being responsible to another person? So when we're talking about being responsible for another person, there's a real you focus in that. It's a trying to change the other. Whereas being responsible to another person is an I focus, working on what is in your control and managing yourself in that relationship. I think this is not a focus on self that is selfish, but it's actually keeping your emotional energy directed into things that you can actually do something about and working on the best resource you can actually offer to another person, which is yourself. So we think about this you and I focus, shifting the focus from changing the other. These are the sorts of things. That's a good question, that pastoral conversation, but I'm going to leave that for later because I'm going to run out of time. Shifting the focus from changing the other. So the you focus. You need to change. You are, yes, you need to, X. If you don't do that, I will need to. If you do that, I'll be really grateful and let others know. How great. You must be needing more support. You need more accountability. You haven't done what I said you must do. Why haven't you done that? You can see how intense this can get the more worried you get about someone in a relationship. In systems thinking, we talk about the difference between this and an I position, which is about working on yourself and defining yourself in the relationship and representing yourself, showing up in the relationship. I am willing to do this, or I'm not willing to do that. Here's how I'm thinking. How are you thinking about that? I'm committed to working this out because it is important to me. I can see this is difficult, but I'm not going to change my mind because I've thought about this, and this is what's important to me. I will give you the space to work out what you think or how you want to respond to this. I appreciate your response, or even I'm disappointed in your response, but I'll stay connected with you. This bit is actually what you're in control of in relationships. And I appreciated what Rosemary said this morning about you can't change other people. And we know that in our heads, but gosh, we try and do it all the time, don't we? Like, how much energy do we put into trying to convince other people to change their mind or agree with me, or things would just be better if you just did it differently? You can't change the other person, and this can be a real challenge when there's tension in relationships. Now, the other way we talk about this is being a solid self, and this is about responding and not reacting. So part of the challenge of this is to kind of do your own thinking about what's important to you and maintain this thinking and clarity amidst the pressure that comes with relationships. So when people feel stressed or ask you to do things differently or complain, or it gets really intense. So in systems thinking, we talk about this as a challenge to define yourself, to be a solid self, and to bring this intentionality into relationships. So a solid person has inner convictions that have been formed gradually and can only be changed from within, not from relationship pressure. This person is able to do some of these things, express a viewpoint clearly without insisting on being right or being disinterested in other people's views. Balance working on independent goals with seeking and nurturing closeness with others, to stay connected with others without losing their ability to voice different viewpoints, to tolerate intense feelings in themselves and others without an impulsive drive to alleviate those feelings, to focus on self and their part when a difficulty arises in a relationship, and to take responsibility for managing their own anxieties without needing to take responsibility for the feeling states of others. They're just some descriptions. There'd be other ones as well. Now, this sort of description, I think, of being more mature, being solid, not wavering because of the emotional pressure, it reminds me of Paul's wonderful description in Ephesians of what it means for the Ephesians to be grounded and rooted in the Word of God, to be solid in it and not to flounder or change their mind because of the next best thing on offer or the pressure that came their way to think or do things differently. And Paul says this, then we will no longer be infants, tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching and by the cunning and craftiness of people in their deceitful scheming. This could be a whole nother topic, couldn't it? I suspect there's a connection between helping people to be emotionally mature and their growth in spiritual maturity. But it strikes me that the steadier people are in their own thinking and their convictions, that the less reactive they are, and also the less quick they are to adopt different ideas on a whim because they sound good or because of the relationship pressure or they think that that's what will be accepted or approved of. They're more likely to be thoughtfully and consistent in what their beliefs are and also have the capacity to go deeper into that. I'm going to leave you with that thinking, but maybe it's worth an experiment in some ways. Now, we're going to finish by thinking a little bit more about what a solid self looks like in pastoral relationships and the challenge of bringing this into these relationships. Now, let me just say that this sort of effort is not easy and definitely not as rewarding or gratifying as a short-term fix. So let's go back to our story about Melrick the magician. The book ends by saying, everyone went happily about their business after Melrick declares that he won't be doing everything for them anymore. But in reality, I suspect this would not be the case. In fact, I think, knowing what we know about relationships, this is how that part of the book would read. Everyone was pretty put out by Melrick's declaration that he was not going to use his magic to do things for them anymore. They whinged and complained and tried to convince Melrick that they were incapable of doing their tasks. Some pretended to get sick. Some actually did get sick by the stress of it all. But as Melrick over time held his position and thought carefully about when and how his magic would be used, people in turn made some adjustments themselves. They picked up tools and trades and learnt skills for the first time or remembered skills they'd previously had and forgotten. Over time, despite some grumbling and pushback, people eventually recovered some of their own agency in the process and discovered they could do things they hadn't realised. This in turn gave them hope and confidence to do more things. And the next time they had to solve a similar problem, they grumbled a bit, but it didn't take as long. But no one really thanked Melrick. Life was definitely easier when he had done things for them. But maybe, just maybe in the long run, people had benefited from having to do things the hard way. One of the real challenges is, to be honest, overfunctioning can feel so good. And so can underfunctioning at times, but we can get pulled into those being an automatic quick fix. And the challenge is to extract ourselves and think about what are the longer term goals that we're going for in relationships, and what does that mean about how I manage myself and position myself with people. We see in the way we can jump in and want to fix things quickly, just how much of that kind of helping can be more about the anxiety of the helper than the actual needs of the person they're trying to help. Being an emotionally mature helper means working on your own reactivity and taking responsibility to manage yourself well in the relationship. So what does this look like? Thinking about the 4 C's. Being in good contact, that is, being not over or under involved. The questions here are about actually being in contact, and I mean direct contact with the person yourself rather than talking to others about them or feeling by osmosis that you think you know what's going on. Anxiety can kind of make us distance from people in really strange ways. I just want to share this example. I had a conversation with someone quite a while ago about what sort of contact she was having with her sister who had cancer, to which she answered lots of contact. So much contact, in fact, that it was making her feel really overwhelmed. When we explored the type of contact, it was mostly texting with a few phone calls and only the occasional visits because they were really busy in person. What's the difference between that different type of contact was one of the things we thought about. Well, she said, when I text her, I realise I have these images of her lying on the couch, unable to move, and I feel so stressed, not sure what's going to come back on the text when I text her. But actually, I feel less worried about her when I see her in person because I'm reminded that she's still my annoying little sister. She's up and moving. She can do things, and I actually don't feel as worried about her. This is contact that's based on the facts, and having in-person contact with people can help keep relationships grounded in reality and objectivity, whereas a lack of contact and distancing can really exacerbate anxiety and worries and keep them circling around assumptions that we might have. It's definitely harder from the pandemic and post-pandemic life, but it's still worth thinking about what sort of contact you have and what are the facts. Being calm. One of the things we know about anxiety is that it's contagious. It can spread really quickly between people, and we can easily take on other people's anxieties as something we need to resolve. But being calm can also be contagious. What's really interesting about Bowen's work is that he thought his main job as a therapist was to work on being the calmest person in the room. Because if an anxious person can have contact with a neutral, calm other person, it will help automatically create a space to think differently. Now, sometimes what this involves is trying to stay objective and focus on the facts rather than speculating. So if you can work on managing your own anxiety, I don't think it's about having no anxiety, but I think it's working on what does having a bit less looks like. Work on being a calm and consistent presence in a person's life. Being a touch point of calm can help reduce the anxiety from escalating because it's not being fed by another anxious person to kind of fuel it. We're almost there. Being curious. Curiosity is the key. I think curiosity is actually about a position of humility. It keeps us from being proud in the process of helping others. So when we're curious, we're positioning ourselves in relation to the other person and essentially saying, I want to hear from you. You have thinking you've done or that you can do, or you can do now, even while we're meeting, and I want to hear it from you. I know you read the Bible and think and pray, and I want to hear what you're learning and thinking about. I know you have experiences from the past. I know you've been in tough times before and you've gotten through it, and I know you have ideas now about what's helping or not helping, and I want to hear it from you. It's, like I said before, it's not about never sharing your own thinking with others, but it's about how and when you do this, and who's actually taking responsibility for the problem and who's going to do what about it. Lastly, being clear about yourself and your own thinking and position. This comes back to the idea about solid self, I think, that we talked about before. And part of this work is about the ability to tolerate uncomfortableness and discomfort in relationships. And the more you can do this and accept people in all their messiness, the more you help others learn that being messy people in this world is okay. I'm just going to finish with sharing these slides. I'm not going to go through this content, but I'm going to point you in the direction of this work by Tara Stenhouse, who did a lot of research and thinking herself about this shift from what she talks about being a rescuing pastor to being a coaching pastor, which she talks about as getting alongside people and trying to apply these things in practice. She's actually written a chapter about this in a book that I'm going to point you to in a minute. But she actually talks about that this became really important to her because it became much more sustainable in her caring role and in her pastoral role. And I really appreciate Tara's descriptions in these tables and in her chapter, and just how she's kind of brought that to life in a really practical way. I'm going to finish just with some of these reflection questions. I'm reading them out loud, but just to keep some thinking going. Which of these questions particularly resonate for you? Is my help actually helping? Am I taking from another what they could be doing for themselves? Am I being a resource or a rescuer? Am I coming alongside and supporting, or am I seeking to rescue and fix another person? Am I inadvertently making a project out of changing the other person? Am I putting more energy into their growth and change than they are? How much of my own steadiness is tied to helping, or being seen to be helping, or being seen as competent and in control? Am I able to tolerate the discomfort of things not going smoothly for others so they get a chance to work on their problems? And am I assuming things about the other person, or am I asking to hear more from them directly? I'm just going to put this next slide up as some other resources. So Rosemary's helpfully got some copies of Growing Yourself Up, which I really recommend. It's an application of systems thinking to different life ages and stages, and it's very applicable and accessible. There's a book there called Family Systems and Congregational Life, which is a bit more theory heavy, but it's an excellent book for those who want to kind of dive into that a little bit more. The blue book up there is Family Systems Thinking, Family System, I wrote it, I should know the title. Bowen, Family Systems Theory and Christian Ministry. How embarrassing. Which is a collection of papers that Jenny and I brought together from different thinkers, and we've got our own stuff in there, about the application of systems thinking to different kind of ministry contexts. So that's where Tara's chapter is. I've got a chapter on there about being a ministry wife and being caught in loads of relationship triangles and what that's, thinking about systems theory in that way. Some really good things in there. And the other book, Everything Isn't Terrible, is another very accessible book by a woman called Kathleen Smith, who's very funny, which I really like, and it's this attempt to zoom out and see yourself in relationships and kind of try and get a bit more objective in that. I'm also just going to point to, for those who are interested, at the Family Systems Institute, we run a whole bunch of kind of systems in ministry stuff. Not a Christian organisation, but trying to apply this theory in Christian contexts. And we have a symposium coming up in October. So jump on the website, join the newsletter, look on the website, whatever about that. I'm going to stop talking for a while. Thank you.